The agenda for today, before I pass it off to you, Rebecca, to kind of take it over, is we're going to do an introduction to GBTA and the organization as a whole, as well as the entire Extreme Heat Adaptation and Indigenous Communities series. We're going to be doing some panelist presentations and Q&A. So we have some really great panelists here today. If we have time for it, maybe some breakout room discussions, but we'll sort of play that by ear depending on how Q&A goes. And then at the end, we're going to do a resource sharing and closeout. So I'll pass it off to you, Rebecca.
All right. Hello, everybody. So my boss, Tanaya, is hopefully going to be joining us here, but is having some technical Wi-Fi issues and stuff. So I'm going to kind of explain who we are. Great Basin Tribal Alliance is an intentional, coordinated, ongoing convergence centered on Indigenous extreme weather preparedness and economic resiliency across the Great Basin region. So we try to serve all sorts of tribal peoples in the Great Basin and bring them all together, right? This includes opportunities for information and resource sharing, capacity building, training, workforce development, and natural resource planning and management that is both Indigenous-led and Indigenous-focused. So Tanaya is Indigenous, as am I, from different tribes and such, but some of the pictures you see here are us at our last event that we tabled at the top right there, and then sort of in the middle at the bottom there is some pictures from our most recent gathering, our most recent convergence. Okay, next slide. So kind of some of the ways that we run this is that we have in-person convergences that rotate across various locations within the Great Basin. We try to hold them like once a quarter or so. We try to provide opportunities for trainings, community outreach, other such things that get people involved. These meetings are co-hosted with various tribes. We just had one hosted by the Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone tribe. And then the previous one before that, we had the assistance and help hosting from the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California. They will organize the meeting. They will get people to present on various topics in their communities, such as projects they're working on, resources that they have that they can share, all those kinds of things in regards to land stewardship, climate and weather adaptation, cultural and language revitalization, and other such things, right? We also try to have virtual meetings on a monthly basis in between the quarterly convergences so that we can continue to plan them, continue to share. Sometimes when not enough people are joining, we'll substitute it with a training like this or a webinar like this that gets more resources out to people, right? We also put out a newsletter every month that has sort of upcoming events, trainings, grant opportunities, job openings, and other such things. And also we'll highlight the most recent community events, conferences, or other things that we have been a part of. So that is Great Basin Tribal Alliance. Please check out the link in the chat if you want more information. That is the website for GBTA. It's also on all of these slides throughout the thing. So if you lose it or can't find it, it's on the slides there. But yeah, we are also hosting this in part with Climate Science Alliance. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Althea to tell us about her organization.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Althea Walker. I'm Nez Perce, Hopi, and Gila River, and the Director of Community Resilience for the Climate Science Alliance. We are a nonprofit based on Kumeyaay lands in San Diego, California. But we're very fortunate to work closely and be affiliated with the Great Basin Tribal Alliance, with the Desert Research Institute, San Diego State University, and all the other various partners supporting this webinar. So we're happy that you all have joined us. If you're not familiar with the Climate Science Alliance, we're all about convening, investing, and igniting the communities that we work in and with to support transformational climate adaptation. And we are always doing something fun. We're always up to something. And so we definitely want to invite you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll make sure to put it in the chat or share it in the notes after this webinar is over. But yes, we just wanted to invite you to continue following us and having an opportunity to participate in convenings such as this, and getting provided with various information and resources that advances the work in your own communities. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Althea. And I think this is off to me. So yeah, I was introducing the entire thing earlier, but my name is Lauren Halili. One of the hats that I wore was program coordinator for CJ. And what CJ is we're a technical assistance center that's based at San Diego State University. And we support entities like community-based organizations, tribal organizations, governments and municipalities, things of that nature. We were formally funded by the EPA, and we're currently working on securing additional funding to support our full technical assistance kind of menu that you see here. But in the meantime, we're focusing really on grant support and, which includes grant identification, grant writing trainings. We have grant application templates and checklists. We can do one-on-one advising, proposal reviews, things like that. So we'll also drop in our contact information in the chat if you have a funding opportunity that you're working on or you're looking to seek assistance regarding grant support. We can kind of help answer those questions for you or help provide guidance in that way. We also have a community hub that we kind of host a lot of our resources on, and there's a QR code on the bottom right hand of the screen that you can scan, but we'll also drop a link in the chat. So just wanted to highlight these services are available to y'all, and Paige and I are here on the team to provide that support.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. Sorry, everyone to hop back in, but my internet went out. So I'm Tanaya Woodluna. I'm an Indigenous Climate Stewardship Director at Desert Research Institute, working with Becca, as she mentioned, and I'm the facilitator of the Great Basin Tribal Alliance. So thanks again for joining. To hop back in on where I should have been with you all before. So this is the second of the three-part series for extreme heat in Indigenous communities. So our first one was in May for household level adaptation. This one is community level. And then next month, we're going to be talking at more of the regional level. Next slide, please. So last month, we had three great folks talking about household level adaptations to extreme heat in Indigenous communities. So Patrick Urbane, who's an epidemiologist at DRI, talked mostly about understanding heat effects in the household and also how you can identify if someone's having a heat emergency. After Patrick, we had Colleen Bodenreiter, who's from the Climate Change and Health Data Lead at the Public Health Alliance. And they talked about the California Healthy Places Index, Extreme Heat Edition, and some other tools that are pertinent to Indigenous communities. And then we had Mansell Nelson from ITEP, Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, talking about DIY home filters and cooling. So how different ways and different kind of adaptations that you can do at home to deal with extreme heat. All right, next slide. And feel free to watch that recording as my colleagues mentioned before. So now we're going to get into the panel presentation and discussion. We have some great folks here with us today. So first slide. So this has two folks, but we're actually just going to go with David Almanza, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Nevada Heat Lab at Desert Research Institute. David, would you like to introduce yourself and kick us off here?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So Tanaya's great introduction. I'm part of the Nevada Heat Lab. I started actually about a year ago. I'm a social scientist, and today I'm going to be focusing more on the community-based approaches to reframing heat. So I'm very excited. Thank you so much for having me. Let's go ahead with the next slide. Like I mentioned, I'm part of the Nevada Heat Lab, and you will be hearing from our lead in the next session, I believe, when you talk about regional practices. But the Nevada Heat Lab, we focus on different types of research. We have worked in the past with mapping campaigns, and right now part of our team is focused on studying shade disparity or tracking, the way in which trees are functioning throughout southern Nevada. And I come from a background of social science. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about culture, the way in which society interacts with heat, and the way in which language affects that. But before that, I'd like to kind of contextualize something that maybe we're all familiar with, but it's a good reminder. So next slide. This is the most recent data that we've received from the National Weather Service regarding weather fatalities on heat, right? And I think it's safe to say that most of us are aware that heat takes many, many lives, but seeing these numbers reminds us that, you know, as soon as 2024, heat is in fact the #1 weather-related killer in the United States and also in our state of Nevada. You can see that it actually outnumbers both tornadoes and hurricanes combined. And yet, the way in which we talk about heat, the way in which we contextualize heat in our communities, right? The sort of cultural perception of heat is not always as disastrous, as powerful. You know, we don't treat it with the same magnitude as we might treat a tornado or a hurricane. Next slide. Here's some more just context. These are emergency department visits, ER visits from last summer, which, as you may recall, was the hottest summer on record. And it feels almost like every new summer is a new hottest summer on record. And you can see that, you know, for most of the counties here in Nevada, there was definitely a peak around July. But the numbers have continuously increased year by year. So what this tells us is heat, as a matter of fact, is an emergency, right? There is extreme temperatures that are affecting people's lives, but not only is it taking people's lives, it also is affecting people's livelihoods in many ways. It has a financial impact. If your AC goes out, it has a societal impact because many people are not able to congregate perhaps as often or in places outdoors as they would otherwise. So I want to focus on, again, that cultural perception we have of heat, of something that takes so many lives and has such a big impact. Next slide. So how we talk about heat matters. Think about the way the messaging that you have received that maybe we've all been exposed to regarding heat. Usually you may be familiar with phrases like beat the heat, fighting fire, or surviving, right? When you say, oh, I'm just surviving summer. And I would just invite all of us to start questioning some of the phrasing that we use when it comes to heat, right? I know specifically when we're talking about Indigenous communities, and I'm going to cover this in a few slides, but we may tend to normalize the experience of heat. And I'm just going to focus briefly on the phrase beat the heat. And the reason that I focus on this particular phrase is because we don't communicate about other weather disasters or weather hazards in that way, right? We don't say beat the hurricane or beat the tornado because it might be misinterpreted and we might be sort of downplaying the severity that, as a matter of fact, there is a level of heat that is invincible. And that messaging can sort of obscure how we approach heat. And so what does this tell us, right? That the narratives we emphasize that sometimes come across as telling people to just buckle up and, you know, do your part. And of course, there are, as we, you know, covered last time, household solutions. There are things that individuals need to do, such as staying hydrated and, you know, doing personal things. But today, we also need to highlight that heat is an issue of collective action. While there are individual mitigations that are required for every day, heat as an extreme hazard requires communal interventions, just like other natural disasters. And so what if our cultural narratives could be used to emphasize the communal needs that we have rather than avoid it and sort of put all of responsibility onto just the individual? Next slide. So one of the ways that we can begin to think about this, right, is to begin to bring life to heat as something that has agency, as something that is part of our planet, and think of it as a natural rhythm, not just a threat that we need to beat the heat, right? but rather maybe the heat is a way in which our planet is providing us feedback for the practices, right? For human activity, for our built environment. We understand that there are levels of heat that are unprecedented. So what if we, instead of seeing heat as just a threat, may reinterpret heat as a way in which the Earth is giving us feedback for the way that we are treating our natural environments. And so there is more of a relationship and feedback and communication with our environment rather than just seeing this as a hazard, as a threat. What does it mean for us to understand that every summer is the hottest summer ever when we are building our environments in a certain way, when we are, taking up resources in the way that we are, and perhaps what would it mean to reframe our relationship with our natural resources in the context of human activity related to heat. So what does it mean for us to develop that resilience moving forward, understanding CO2 emissions and understanding all of the things that human activity has an impact? What does it mean to take a step back? And I know that in many ways I'm preaching to the choir, but I think that that is a very unique perspective that Indigenous perspectives can bring into the conversation. Next slide. So what does it look like to do that? It means that we begin to talk about heat in a way that provides agency to living beings. That means we provide agency to all humans, but also more than humans. When we talk about our natural habitats, we do so in a way that that considers sort of the sovereignty of our natural world. And we also consider the knowledge that natural ecosystems can provide. So agency belongs both to the community as well as the natural world. Not in a way, we don't see the natural world as subservient to our needs. We see it more as something that is harmonious to the way that we cohabitate within this environment. And so heat is, in that context, becomes a condition to understand, to anticipate, and sometimes to adapt to. So in this way, when we reframe, cultural knowledge will help us strengthen both science and storytelling. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next few slides. So here's a quote from a resident of the Mojave Desert, saying that there's a saying for Mojave people that you're a Mojave. If you can eat a hot bowl of stew in the middle of the summer, heat is not something that's unusual. However, what is unusual is just how hot it's getting. And so this is actually, I thought, such a great quote to highlight what we're dealing with, because many people think of heat as an issue of comfort, right? In many ways, generations have experienced heat, and we see it. If you grow up in areas that are hot, sometimes you see it as a mark of being a true native to that region, that you can buckle up and just survive the heat season. What's different though is that we are reaching record temperatures, and there is a point in which heat is not just an issue of comfort or discomfort, but it becomes an issue of life or death. And that's the kind of emphasis that I would like to really focus on. When we do talk about extreme heat, we are talking about not just an issue of buckle up, not just an issue of having grit or really being true to the region, but it's actually an issue of recognizing the severity of the natural habitat. So cultural framing in this way will offer us a way to sort of understand our own identity and the identity of particular regions, to recognize a path to resilience. So we may say, and for full disclosure, I'm not Indigenous. I am from Colombia. Actually have a very similar cultural experience with my mom making sancocho in the hottest days of summer. But what this could mean is that we reframe to say that maybe to be a true Colombian or true Mojave, someone from this region, means also that we are looking out for people during the heat, right? We start bringing in new concepts, new ways to navigate extreme heat that are additional to this idea of just buckling down. Next slide, please. And how do we do that? So one way that we can suggest to do this is by recognizing the limits of toughing it out culture. So we want to take pride because we are strong, right? As different cultures are, we take pride in the endurance that it takes to live in particular regions, this case, really hot regions. But if we only focus on that aspect, it can result in masking or sort of being dismissive of the very real structural disparities that heat exacerbates. So what does that mean? If we only focus on toughing it out language, we fail to recognize that there are particular people within our community that will be affected, that have limitations that are different than others. So we're talking about our elders, we're talking about people who are pregnant, we're talking about children whose limits when it comes to toughing it out are different than other people in our community. So this idea that it's just a matter of toughing it out and surviving, it's not one size fits all. So when we think of community, we do have to think, and I would invite you to think about all of us, right? Regardless of our age, regardless of, so let's sort of begin there. And that means that true resilience might mean knowing when to rest, knowing when to cool down, and also communal resilience, knowing how to organize and adapt. So just to provide to take this thought a few steps further. How do we begin? And this is why I'm so excited and so thrilled to be part of today's panel, because when we think of community solutions, I think if you are a planner, if you're a stakeholder, a legislator, sometimes we tend to want to tell the people what to do, right? But when you're working in social science, you know that the first step is to listen to people on the ground, everyday lived experiences of people who are already doing the thing you are looking to do as a group. And so we listen to these household solutions. We listen to people in how they are surviving and how they are coping, how they're checking in on their neighbors. And one of the ways that we do that, specifically at the Nevada Heat Lab, we're so thrilled to be conducting survey research this summer where we are talking to everyday folks in the Southern Nevada region. And so what would that look like in a way, to explore Indigenous experiences? I don't know. That would be something to explore in the future. So it would be great to have a better understanding of how trees provide shade, community cooling that is relevant to the region, because again, what works in one region may not work in the other. And to hear how people are already talking about heat. What are the stories? What is the language that's being used? And to amplify that local messaging rather than impose our own messaging onto that community. And in doing that, we co-develop these resources through sustained partnerships. So these are processes that take time. We often hear the phrase moving at the speed of trust, and I think that's fair. Working with any community requires trust. I kind of already provided a little bit of an overview as to how the Nevada Heat Lab has been able to begin tackling this, but ways in which this can happen. How can we capture culture in developing solutions? One is community storytelling projects. Asking people to share their anecdotes. Sometimes, numbers only go so far. Cooling station retrospectives, like a project that I mentioned, sort of pulling people who are already using resources in the community, like cooling stations, going to these and surveying and saying, hey, what challenges did you have getting here? And also adapting those with the data that we've already gathered about, per se, water trade-offs of shade disparity and other. So working in tandem between cultural, anecdotal, citizen knowledge, and scientific data that has been collected in a more academic way, per se. Ways that we can do this, again, is just to highlight stories as science. Knowledge in many Indigenous communities is passed through oral histories. We know that place-based stories are important. And this, again, can be even within someone's own home. So highlighting these stories of people that it is qualitative knowledge. That is qualitative science. So highlighting those approaches like interviews, photo voice, that will give us context that we cannot capture through counting numbers. And it affirms the agency of people who may not, be represented in quantitative research. So we don't want to think of communities, we don't want to think of individuals as just research subjects. We want to understand that we are knowledge holders, that our communities have knowledge already to provide, rather than us trying to, again, impose what we think we know. People know a lot more than we may assume. Again, just to reemphasize, although metrics are important, I began this presentation showing you the statistics. We want to go beyond that. We want to go beyond the numbers, because numbers miss the emotional, cultural costs of heat illness, which can be devastating. So integrating both, contextualizing the numbers with the lived experiences is what's going to have a greater impact into developing adaptation and mitigation efforts that actually work. And so this is where the collective aspect comes in. Individual advice, again, says stay hydrated. That will only go so far. What we're looking to do now is move beyond that to community level actions, such as cooling stations, shared shade, mutual aid. And so in this case, again, asking people to think, and asking ourselves to think, of heat as an issue of collective action. What does it mean to address heat as a group? Cultural framing can guide these practices, because it can tell us, because culture tells us what our shared values are, what our shared beliefs are. And so if we have an understanding of what our culture around heat is, that will give us a guideline for how to develop solutions that protect all of us from the heat, from the extreme heat. Next slide, please. So two key things, again, to take away from this invitation to consider culture when it comes to understanding extreme heat. One, intergenerational wisdom and shared rituals help adapt communities together. So change happens through time, right? But it's important to consider intergenerational wisdom. How have things been done in the past? Understanding that our temperatures are changing and they will probably require differences in the future, and rituals sometimes help us navigate those changes. And planning efforts must reflect the trust, the relationship building, and the rootedness, again, for authentic solutions. Next slide. So I will wrap up by just reminding all of us that culture is the foundation of communal strength. It is necessary for us to highlight cultural practices because we need data, we need infrastructure, but we also need narratives and memory and connection that make these changes authentic and true to each particular community. And Indigenous knowledge shows us a pathway already for how these adaptation practices can happen. And so what we have to do is listen and amplify those golden nuggets of knowledge. And I believe that's all I have today. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. I'm so thrilled that I get to highlight the importance of culture. I know there are many practical outcomes that will be discussed, but feel free to reach out, and thank you so much.
Thank you, David. We so appreciate you joining us and highlighting kind of that interconnectedness and importance of connection when we go about extreme heat solutions. So wonderful. Thank you for starting us off. All right. Next, we're going to hear from Heather Lafferty. Heather, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we've got you loud and clear.
Okay, brilliant. I am Heather Lafferty, and I am the Chief Resilience Officer and State Hazard Mitigation Officer. I'm in a dual role for the Nevada Governor's Office of Emergency Management. And so I'm an emergency manager at heart, and I am super excited to get to talk to everyone today. And we can go to the next slide. And we'll start from here. That's great. Thank you, everybody. Again, I am excited to dive into such an important topic. And if I look outside here in Las Vegas, a timely topic, it is extreme heat season here. and how we make it through these increasing events together is a very worthwhile topic, and I'm super excited to get to participate in it. Just a little background, because I think it's helpful when you understand why a topic has such an impact, or why someone is engaged in this type of work. And so I am a grassroots scholar in disability justice. And of course, right, the Chief Resilience Officer and an emergency manager at the state level, who help our local jurisdictions and tribal nations in Nevada plan, train, and exercise for these type of hazards and heat events. But I also wanted to highlight why heat in particular has been so important to me as a focus of my work, and such a passion. And that's because for 25 years, I was also an EMT, or a medic, in Southern Nevada. And so I saw firsthand the deadly impacts that heat events have on my patients. And I'm also a mother. My daughter, who is now 22 years old, was born with trisomy 21, more commonly called Down syndrome. And so extreme heat events have significant impacts on her ability to maintain her health too. And so I'm very excited to talk to everyone today. Next slide. So I'm gonna, our conversation today is really going to bob and weave and interweave with and really reinforce a lot of what David just shared with us. We're going to be going over some of the same topics in very specific ways, because some of these conversations are vital to have inside our communities and with our communities. And we really want to make sure that we first start. I always like to start with the facts on the ground. So David touched on some of them in the previous presentation, but I want to talk specifically about my wheelhouse here, which is Southern Nevada. So right in Southern Nevada in 2024, we had 28 record daily highs last year, 16 days of extreme heat warnings, and 526 heat fatalities. And kind of to re-emphasize the point David was making at the beginning of his presentation, I really want you to pause and think about that number, 526 heat fatalities. And if we took that number and we applied that to any other hazard, if we had a wildfire in Nevada with 526 homes lost and fatalities, or an earthquake, or a cooling event, a blizzard with 526, Nevadans lost, this would not just be a tragedy for Nevada. This would be a nationwide tragedy and an international, conversation. And so really, as David was talking about, reframing how we're thinking about the hazard of heat and what that means when these extreme heat events are happening. So I am, next slide, please. Thank you. I am, like I mentioned, primarily at heart an emergency manager, which means I am a planner at heart. And a lot of what I do is go into communities and our local jurisdictions, our tribal nations here in Nevada, and help them plan. And any good planner, right, when we're starting a plan, is using your planning assumptions. And so we come up, we use all of the traditional knowledge, the data sets that we have, all of our lived experiences, and we come up with some specific planning assumptions that we know are going to happen in every specific hazard, or that we can anticipate based on all of this traditional knowledge or these data sets, the science that we have, that these are the assumptions that are going to happen every time an event happens. And how are we going to respond and mitigate and recover knowing that these assumptions are going to happen during this hazard. So the first hazard assumption that we're going to talk about with heat, our first planning assumption is extreme heat events will increase in frequency and severity. So if I'm sitting down with you in your local community hall or the conference room, and we're really starting to get into these planning assumptions with this first one, some of the things we're really going to explore, right, is that early identification and cultural responsive communication can make or break our heat response efforts. And this is kind of just reinforcing what David was talking to us about, right? The plan needs to emphasize the importance of identifying our extreme heat events early, using temperature thresholds and heat data. But, you know, for our tribal communities, this means really taking control of how we define and respond to heat threats, and how that impacts us at a local level. And so for the action side of that, right, from this planning assumption, we can establish our own community-based heat alert system that's taking into account who is most at risk. Like David mentioned, right? Our elders living alone, those with chronic health conditions, family without cooling. These systems should go beyond generic weather alerts and really focus in on how that's going to affect people on the ground. And so collaborating, you know, with our local tribal health agencies is key. Through our heat surveillance in particular, we can track, you know, who's getting sick, where, under what conditions, and the real data that we can use to save lives and strengthen our future response and our future planning assumptions. So I did want to highlight here too, a little bit on and kind of back up what David was talking about, which is, you know, communication, words matter. And so when we say extreme heat alert, or for instance, an example I like to use is shelter in place. What does that mean across generations in your community in particular? So for instance, for our elders, when we say shelter in place, they might be recalling nuclear drills, hiding under their desk in schools from fallout, right? For our children, when we are using that term, they are probably bringing to mind, right, an active shooter situation, barricading the doors. And neither one of those interpretations are really going to help us during a heat wave in particular. And so, you know, how we are speaking matters, that it's culturally grounded and generationally grounded. And that might mean using things like plain language, offering visuals or stories, again, tied to traditional knowledge, like David was walking us through, letting our elders guide how these messages are shaped and delivered, and really collaborating at a community level to make sure this is relevant to us. Next slide. So some of our planning assumptions. Planning assumption number 2 is that in a heat event, right, if we're planning this at a community level, power outages and infrastructure strains are likely during heat events. And so based off that planning assumption and all of our experience with these heat events, you know, let's really talk about 2 life-saving components of heat response, cooling centers and energy resilience. So first, right, our plan should stress that communities should identify, prepare, and publicize cooling centers, you know, before the heat hits. And for our tribal communities, you know, this is about leveraging what we already have, but doing it intentionally. So thinking about our tribal clinics, our schools, our community centers, you know, these places can serve as culturally grounded, safe cooling spaces, but only if they're prepared in advance. So one of the things, you know, I do when I'm sitting down with my tribal partners, and we're planning through some of this, is we're looking at, and we're physically going out and looking at, are these places ADA accessible for our elders, right, who might use mobile devices? Do they have backup generators and battery systems for power outages? And if they don't, is there grant funding or ways that we can get that? Are there, water stations, cooling fans, or cots? And most importantly, does the community know these places are open and safe for us to use? Because we can't really just assume that because, we've done all this pre-planning and we have this facility, that when we open the door, people are going to use it, right? So publicizing these spaces in advance in a way that really reflects your culture and language is essential. One of our, basic assumptions with this planning assumption is that we are going to need energy resilience. And so our basic planning assumption acknowledges that power infrastructure can, and often does, fail during extreme heat events, which is causing a cascade of problems, especially in people's ability to maintain their health. So, for many tribal communities, especially in rural areas, this can be catastrophic. So really thinking about, investing in solar and battery microgrids at a community level. And it's not just about sustainability, it's also about survival often. And so powering a clinic, a cooling center for even a few key homes that maybe require durable medical equipment can really help prevent tragedy. But on top of that, we really want to make sure that we're training our own people, when we do invest in these systems, to manage these systems. That self-determination piece in action. So when your community knows how to run its own power in some of these systems you invest in, that makes you less reliant on delayed external aid. And so, I would say that's a really kind of big piece of this as well. And then, of course, lastly, kind of our key strength in our smaller Indigenous communities is, we know each other. We know who has oxygen machines that need electricity. We know who can't cool themselves without AC, who lives alone without a car or a phone. And so we need to use that knowledge as a tool, right, to plan intentionally with them, right? Not just put them on a list of things we might need to check on when the event happens, but, sit down and co-create a plan together for what happens when the power goes out. Next slide. So our third planning assumption, David and I have hit on quite a bit, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it is that vulnerable populations, right, are at a higher risk during an extreme heat event. But I do want to explore that just a little bit, right, about who's at risk during extreme heat and why it's crucial to understand that ultimately everyone is vulnerable under the right conditions. So, we often start with those high-risk groups, our elders, right, especially those living alone or in housing without cooling, people with chronic conditions like heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illnesses, or like my daughter, individuals who rely on durable medical equipment that need power, right? Children, of course, whose bodies can't regulate and they regulate a little differently. And of course, those experiencing medical health conditions or taking medications that impair their temperature regulation. But I do want to talk about something that gets overlooked, which is, extreme heat doesn't just affect people in high risk categories or with pre-existing health problems, right? During the 2003 European heat wave, right? Which killed thousands of people across multiple countries. You know, many of those who we lost during that event were older adults with no diagnosed health conditions at all. They weren't on any risk registry. They had no obvious vulnerabilities. They were in prime, great physical health until the temperature stayed 100 degrees for multiple days and the nights never cooled. And so, you know, really thinking about in your planning, right? We just can't stop at a check down list of known illnesses in our populations or risks. We got to think about who's socially isolated, and that invisibility risk factor, those unexpected impacts. One of the things, you know, that's got to be a priority is everyone stays cool, you know, everyone stays connected, and everyone stays safe. And some of the ways we might have to talk about that, you know, I adopted with my mom on extreme heat days, calling it a heat blizzard, because there are some, you know, outdoor events and some shopping trips and some things she would not consider doing during a blizzard. And I want that to be in her mind on these extreme heat days. And so, you know, how we talk about these things and reframe them is important. Next slide. Thank you. Our next planning assumption is cooling centers and public messaging may not reach everyone. And so we're going to think about this in two real ways, and not just what the message is, but who's delivering it. And so effective communication, of course, we know can save lives, but especially in a heat emergency, but only if that message is understood, trusted, and actionable, and people are receiving it. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, a lot of public messaging outreach does not reach everyone equally. And so we have our language barriers, our cultural differences, you know, that have impacts, mistrust of official sources. They can leave entire communities with information, without information that they need to be safe. And so, you know, we got to make sure that we are partnering to translate heat warnings and safety guidance into Indigenous languages and using those formats, like David mentioned, that resonate with your particular groups and communities and people, that are not just like text heavy flyers, right? But visual stories, radio messages, oral storytelling, like David mentioned, and, you know, community gatherings. And so it's not just what we're saying, but equally important is who is delivering the message, right? Those trusted messengers, like community health representatives, our elders, or youth advocates in our communities, can really bridge some of those gaps where outside agencies, even agencies like my own, cannot. And there's a growing body of research, really, that people are far more likely to act on preparedness information when it comes from someone they trust. Elders in particular are way more likely to take action on preparedness or warnings when this is discussed by their primary care doctors. And so, you know, really finding those trusted agents like tribal nurse discussing heat safety, right, during a routine home visit, or you know, an elder sharing a story about surviving past weather extremes and what they learned, or our youth leaders posting videos on, you know, TikTok or Blue Sky, I don't know, whatever's cool, in Indigenous languages, right, and explaining you know, what to do during a heat wave. We need outreach that's really in our plans, that we've pre-planned, that is alive and not just like a static flyer or email. And so these are kind of some of the actions that we're thinking about under this planning assumption, and we're working through at the community level. Next slide. Our next planning assumption is heat events can disrupt health services. Again, right, during extreme heat events, our health systems often experience severe strain. David talked to us about how much impact we saw on hospital visits, right, in the previous presentation. And for our rural and tribal communities, that strain can become a breaking point because we already have underfunded clinics or services. And so when we're sitting down with this planning assumption, really thinking about how heat waves and extreme heat events can, again, cause power outages that are impacting refrigeration for our medications like insulin, limit access to, healthcare because of road conditions, staff shortages, or overwhelmed clinics, right? Increasing the number of patients suffering from heat-related illnesses, often in places, especially here, like in Nye County and Lincoln County, where they're already at capacity, at medical capacity, and so really thinking through what can we do about that at a tribal level. And so we start when we're planning with cold storage continuity, right? Talking with our tribal clinics and pharmacies about backup power systems, whether it's generator or solar or, to protect those medications, and training our community health aides and volunteers to really identify and respond to those heat-related illnesses. And another thing we should think through, especially in underserved communities where you might not have access to a ton of professional medical service providers, is you don't need to be a doctor to recognize some of these dehydrations, confusion, or heat exhaustion, and early action can really save lives. So really stressing that educational piece. And then, of course, right, building some of those transportation partnerships in advance. Who has vehicles, who can drive, and which neighboring jurisdictions, can assist in evacuation and reaching cooling centers. And are these arrangements, it's best to make these before the emergency, right, not during. And so, and really coordinating that in a way that protects tribal sovereignty. And so thinking through that piece on this planning assumption. Next slide. Our next planning assumption is we're sitting down to build our community plan is local governments may not fully address tribal needs. So, when it comes to extreme heat preparedness, tribal communities often face a dual challenge, right? So being under-resourced and overlooked in the broader emergency response plans. So one of the most impactful steps we can take is to advocate for those formal partnerships, right? Like memorandums of understanding and, with counties or neighboring jurisdictions. And these agreements can really clarify, who's providing what in the heat emergency? How is communication going to flow? And what MOUs are in place? And then really using those toolkits that have been developed that are tribal specific through multiple different agencies from FEMA to the state to develop those. Next slide. And as we start to wrap up, we have two more planning assumptions. One, heat events impact food systems. This is another one that can often be overlooked. So we really want to think through extreme heat doesn't just threaten people, it also threatens, the systems we rely on for survival. That's why food systems and land use planning, really need to be central part of our resilience strategies. And I think a great place to start with that is food systems. So, when that heat wave strikes, traditional food sources can be lost or degraded. Rivers dry up, And we have, you know, plants that wither, and access to hunting or foraging areas, right, can become limited or dangerous. So to protect these lifelines, you know, we can lean on traditional land practices, you know, like controlled burns or water stewardship. You know, they're not just cultural, these are real strategic tools. You know, and then of course, we can build our, at the same time, we can build our indoor, in, you know, shaded gardening systems. And there are quite a few communities across Nevada that are already doing this. Growing from, you know, food from seed to table year round in climate controlled conditions. And so that's a piece to really, really think through under this particular planning assumption. And next slide. And then our last planning assumption, I really wanted to highlight, if I was sitting down with you when we were going through your plan as a community together, is, you know, climate data may not reflect local Indigenous realities. And we see this not just with climate data, but with data kind of across the board in many areas. So, you know, one of the most important tools, right, we have to battle heat is our data, and how we kind of reclaim and reshape it to reflect our, you know, the Indigenous reality. So when we're planning, really, really emphasize that need for cross-sector collaboration and shared situational awareness. You know, but kind of here's the problem. You know, much of the climate data we use in mainstream systems, you know, often don't capture Indigenous experiences or reflect the conditions on tribal lands. You know, why? Because those systems often rely on, you know, distant weather stations or incomplete health surveillance, or general, you know, very generalized regional forecast. And so, you know, they can miss that local nuance. So launching and thinking through a community-based weather and health monitoring program that really captures those hyper-local conditions, and creating your own climate dashboards that include, you know, those kind of Western indicators, you know, like temperature and humidity, but also our tribal indicators, you know, like seasonal shifts, plant behavior, or animal migration. And so, you know, really coordinating with your cultural leaders, your public health officials, emergency managers, and making sure, you know, your youth and your elders, everyone is kind of in this pot together, and we're writing it in the plan. And so I want to say thank you, next slide, for everyone for letting me kind of take you through my planning assumptions. If I was sitting down with your community to help you plan through some of a heat response. And thank you so much. I'm definitely open for questions.
Thank you so much for sharing, Heather. We'll have time for questions kind of at the end after our last panelist here, but thank you so much for sharing, and we really appreciate all your insight.
Thank you.
All right, wonderful. So last but not least, we have Catherine Foster and Kelly Meza Prado from the California Governor's Office. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Foster. I'm a senior planner with the California Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. And Kelly is currently recovering from a cold, but if you'd like to unmute yourself, Kelly, and say a brief hello, that'd be great.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Leaving it up to Catherine to lead us here.
We also have Colin Green joining us today, and I can go ahead and share my screen and get our slides started. So we've done some introductions already. The one person not present today is our program manager, that's Braden Kay, who leads the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience program at the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. And the presentation today will focus on our tribal grantees under the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Grant Program, as well as some policy work we're currently doing on extreme heat that has a tribal connection. The Extreme Heat and Community Resilience background is that we fund planning and implementation projects aimed to reduce the impacts of extreme heat and build community resilience. We also build frameworks for change, and we invest in local, regional, and tribal projects that strengthen communities that are vulnerable to heat. So tying it back into Heather and David's presentations, we do a lot of the funding work, the grantee work, and some of the policy work in response to the extreme heat crisis that we're currently facing. In our most recent round, that was round one, our pilot round, we delivered $32.6 million in grants across 47 communities in 24 counties throughout California. You can see on the map here, we have representation from the north to the south, from the west, and almost to the east, with some more counties there that we're hoping to get more representation from in our second round. These 47 grantees are bucketed in 4 separate buckets. The first 2 buckets are on planning. So we have our small planning grants, of which there are 20 grantees. We have our large planning grants, which are 11 grantees, our small implementation grants, which are 12 grantees, and then our large implementation grants, which is the biggest bucket in terms of funding. And there are 6 grantees in this bucket. The way we look at it is that we need a diversity of funding options to meet the diversity of needs that the state of California currently has. So if you're in an early development of, say, extreme heat action plan at the local level, you might just be looking for, say, $200,000 just to do some preliminary engagement. If you're looking for even bigger infrastructure developments, so you're the city of Los Angeles wanting to do really in-depth playground retrofits or housing development, and end up applying for a large implementation. And that's sort of how it categorizes across the group. We have 2 projects in the 47 that have a significant tribal component. We do have tribal representation in the other 45 grantees, but these are the most prominent, the 2 that we have here. We will add that we do get a lot of interest in tribal communities and tribal entities in our pre-application process for the grantee program or the grant program. We just didn't see that translated into applications. So our goal for the future is that we'll have more tribal representation in our round 2. So the one project to highlight here is we have the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla Indians. Their co-applicant is the Grid Alternatives of the Inland Empire, and they received almost $3.5 million to do a microgrid system with solar panels, battery storage, and backup generation at the Torres Martinez Reservation. It's a community gym. The goal here is to ensure reliable cooling during extreme heat and power outages. They also have a very dedicated effort around engaging with tribal youth, and they're doing a series of nature-based solutions around native shade trees as part of the project as well. So we're really excited for this one. The second project I wanted to highlight is the Solar Chill project. That stands for the Cooling and Heating Homes with Innovative Low Impact. This is in the lead applicant for this project is North Coast Opportunities. This is in Lake counties, which is a few counties north of where I am in Sacramento. Their co-applicant is the Middletown Rancheria Pomo Indians of California. They received a little less than $2.5 million from the grant. And their goal is to install solar-powered mini splits in homes of senior residents and those with chronic health conditions, with a specific focus on members of the Middletown Rancheria of Pomo Indians. There's also a significant workforce development component to their work to build community resilience and also encourage construction of solar-powered mini splits. So I'm really excited to see that project develop as well, and we'll have more updates throughout the next couple of years as these projects get going. And these are implementation projects from our side. We also have a round 2 coming for our program. So very, very quickly, I'm going to go over the program values from our side, talk about eligible activities, talk about some grant types, and then go over a preliminary timeline. If you're interested in learning more, please connect with Kelly or Colin from our team who lead the grantee and grant program. So when we were doing some early development on our project, we really wanted to identify 3 program values that served as the cornerstone of our work. The first is harm reduction. I think that's pretty clear in the extreme heat world that the ultimate goal is really reducing harm of extreme heat. Our ultimate goal is public health benefits, reducing trips to the emergency room, reducing fatalities tied to extreme heat. As bolstered by the presentations we were seeing, harm reduction is a key component of the work that we do and something that we need to be reiterating again and again when we talk about the importance of extreme heat. Another key component is collaborative partnerships. So for our first round, community engagement was recommended, not required. For round two, we're really requiring that folks engage at the collaborative level with partners, because we think it's important that if you're a community-based organization, for example, you have some type of partnership with local or regional government so you can implement your vision more effectively. The opposite is also true. If you're a local government, you should have a CBO partner who can do engagement for you more effectively than you could do. So we really like to see partnerships really uplifted throughout our grant program. And the last program value we have here is transformative projects. So certainly we have a diversity of grantees already going through this program. I think they're kicking off in the summer. We like to think that these projects are just the start of their extreme heat journey, that if you're in a planning bucket, so to speak, you'll eventually move into an implementation project at some stage. We also support a diversity of peer learning opportunities for our grantees as well, because we want them to be creating the connections and the partnerships they need to do more transformative projects, even if extreme heat is indirectly connected. Certainly in the climate world, it all sort of tends to be quite similar in terms of the multiple benefits that these projects can have. And we see them as catalytic in terms of the potential that they can have over the long term. So for our round two, we slightly updated the structure. So we now have 2 buckets, and I can go over the cost amounts for those 2 buckets just a second. For our early transformative infrastructure projects, these are still going to be infrastructure projects. So they'll have a strong planning component and proof of concept for an infrastructure project, and also have the potential to become an advanced infrastructure project. But we did see this as sort of being a scale. So like an early transformative infrastructure has less requirements, still a planning component, still community engagement to a degree, but less requirements because it's certainly smaller in scale and smaller in funding. For their advanced transformative infrastructure, these are projects that focus on the built environment, so planning, construction, maintenance, etc. Also focus on nature-based solutions. And specifically for this grant type, they have to have partnership and community engagement, both represented in their vision for the project, but also reflected in their budget. And then we're also recommending that they engage with artists and incorporate a communications component as well as part of their work. And for the nuts and bolts, I should share that this is not completely set in stone right now, because we're going to do some community engagement throughout the summer and get some feedback on these categories. But essentially the total funding for our early transformative infrastructure is 4.5 million, and the max project amount in that category is 600,000. So sort of a mid-sized project for our scale. Then our advanced transformative infrastructure has a larger amount of funding with 18 million, with the max project amount about $2 million. We envision that we'll bring on another 20 grantees as part of this project in the fall. Speaking of, throughout the summer, we'll be working on the round 2 guidelines proposal. We'll be doing a series of outreach and listening sessions, and then finalizing the guidelines in the fall. The official release set for September 2025. We then anticipate that full applications will be due in December 2025, with projects starting in January 2027. And we are setting aside some opportunities for technical assistance for those entities that need additional support in pulling together a full application. For contact details, please contact the ICARP contact email here below. I'll also at the very end share a screenshot that you can take that will take you directly to our listserv sign up. And then with the remaining time, very quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our policy work on the extreme heat side as well. So we're a little bit unique within the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation. A lot of our partners and colleagues typically do grant-only projects. within the extreme heat portfolio, we also do some policy work as well. So we have a partnership with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment to support the development of the Cal Heat Score. A Cal Heat Score is structured similarly around other natural disaster scores, think hurricanes or similar. The idea is we will be able to predict to a certain degree how extreme the heat is for a given zip code in a location in California. If you compare that temperature prediction to what has historically been, you'll get a score between 1 to 4. You can look across a 7-week projection for this. It's a great tool for folks in planning development work at the local and regional level. As I mentioned, a great tool for local governments. We also see a really key use case for community-based organizations, also the general public, and part of the development of Cal Heat Score, we have a partnership with the LA Regional Collaborative for Climate Adaptation and Sustainability to host a series of cohorts throughout the summer and fall, focus on heat vulnerable communities. The 3 communities that we have selected because they're particularly susceptible to extreme heat is tribes and indigenous people, outdoor and warehouse workers, and elderly people. If you know of an individual who might be interested in participating in this cohort, or if you yourself would be interested in participating, please connect with the email address here, or also reach out to me directly. I'm happy to drop my email in the chat. This is a paid opportunity at $100 an hour. And then very, very quickly, the other policy work we do is Extreme Heat Action Plan. This is a legislative requirement under SB 306. It's a co-led effort with the California Natural Resources Agency and LCI. And it is an all-of-government approach. There are 59 agencies engaged in this plan. It's 127 different actions across 4 different tracks. And we are required on a 3-year cycle to update this plan. The next update is coming out on July 1st, 2026. And between now and then, we'll be doing a series of engagement activities to connect with communities throughout California, to learn about their extreme heat experiences, and also to talk more broadly about the plan itself. We'll also be doing a series of reviews, has to go through the governor's office as well as our partner agencies in order to be finalized. And then by July 1st, 2026, if all goes according to plan, there'll be an update produced, and then every 3 years sequentially after that, as well as the 2029 and 2032 as well. 2032, so it's like very far off, but certainly coming up quick. And then last slide I'll leave you all on is a little QR code to scan if you'd like to join our listservs. We provide updates on our grant program, Cal Heat Score, and then EHAP with the Extreme Heat Action Plan. Happy to also answer any